He was the kind of man people described with big words. Visionary, innovator, genius. They said he taught machines to speak, as if that made him God. But no one ever asked what it cost him to play that role for so long. His name was Lucas Reinhardt, CEO, German-born, sharp mind, sharper tongue. He had built an empire from silence and syntax, and somewhere along the way, forgot how to talk to human beings. Tonight, he sat beneath a chandelier worth more than most people's yearly salary, laughing with investors who didn't care what he said, only how expensive it sounded. The table glowed with crystal glasses, decanters of burgundy wine, and small, rehearsed smiles. Every joke landed. Every hand shook his. And for a moment, Lucas looked exactly like the man the world believed he was: confident, charming, invincible. But beneath the polished cufflinks and that signature smirk was a man quietly counting the days. He'd been diagnosed 3 months ago, stage for pancreatic cancer. The doctors said 6 months, maybe less. And so, he did what powerful men do when the world starts slipping from their grasp. He worked harder, smiled wider, and pretended nothing was wrong. He could buy another company, but not another heartbeat. He could extend a contract, but not a lifetime. And every time someone called him a living legend, he felt a little more like a ghost. He raised a toast that evening. Another success story, another triumph. To the world, Lucas Reinhardt looked like a man at the height of his life. But inside, he was a man at the edge of it. And maybe that's why he did what he did next. Because arrogance, like fear, is loudest when we feel weakest. That's when he noticed her. A waitress, moving quietly through the room with the calm rhythm of someone who had learned how to disappear in plain sight. Mara Vogel, late 30s, maybe early 40s. Simple uniform, hair tied neatly back. Nothing about her screamed for attention, but there was a stillness to her that didn't belong to this noisy world. When she spoke to another table, her accent slipped out, soft, unmistakably German. To her, it was just a habit. To him, it was nostalgia. A sound from home, something he hadn't heard in years, except in boardrooms and news interviews. He looked up, glass halfway to his lips. That accent pulled something in him, not warmth, not familiarity, just memory. The kind that sneaks up on you before you realize it hurts. But Lucas didn't feel it as nostalgia. He felt it as control. Power. Because in a room full of men who worshipped him, here was someone beneath him, someone who wouldn't answer back. And power, once you've tasted it, becomes an addiction. One word, one careless phrase, one cruel joke. That's all it takes to remind yourself that you still matter. He leaned back in his chair, eyes locked on her as she placed wine glasses at the next table. There was no malice in his expression, only the calm confidence of a man used to winning. He didn't know her name. He didn't care to. To him, she was a prop, background noise in a story where he was always the main character. And as she approached his table, his friends, drunk on laughter and approval, prepared for another round of charm, completely unaware that they were seconds away from watching everything shift. She stopped beside him, pen ready, eyes steady. And in that tiny pause, in that quiet space between habit and humiliation, the universe seemed to hold its breath. He smiled, the kind of smile that wasn't kindness, it was performance. And with that same careless tone he'd used to dominate every room, every deal, every person, he said the words that would change everything. The room smelled of imported wine and quiet ambition. Every sound, the clink of crystal, the scrape of silverware, the low hum of conversation, fit perfectly into the background score of Lucas Reinhardt's life. He thrived in places like this, rooms that reflected him, expensive, controlled, polished, every surface shining, every person pretending. He'd built his career on controlling the tone of every conversation. And tonight, he was performing that same ritual. The one where charm hides insecurity and laughter covers loneliness. A few tables away, Mara Vogel moved silently, her small notepad resting lightly in her hand. She wasn't in a rush. People who work in luxury rarely are. They learn the rhythm of waiting, the art of invisibility. She had that rare kind of calm that unnerved the restless. When she arrived at his table, Lucas looked up and noticed her properly for the first time. Not her face, not yet, but her accent. Soft, precise, unmistakably German. He froze for just a fraction of a second. It reminded him of home, of his father's stern voice echoing through their small Munich apartment, of winters that smelled like books and coffee, of a time when life was simpler, before money complicated everything. But nostalgia, for people like Lucas, wasn't a comfort. It was a weakness, and weakness was something he couldn't afford to show. So, he turned memory into mockery. That was his instinct, to destroy what made him feel. He leaned back in his chair, voice smooth but sharp, the kind of tone that dances just on the edge of cruelty. He said, "I'll give you $1 million if you can take my order in German." The table burst into amusement, a roaring, shallow kind of laughter, the kind that feeds on someone else's discomfort. One of the investors slapped the table. Another wiped tears from his eyes. It wasn't even that funny, but when power laughs, others follow. Lucas smiled faintly, proud of his line, sipping his wine as if he'd just performed a trick. To him, it was nothing. A small act of arrogance, a way to remind himself he still mattered in a world that was already moving on. But to her, it was everything. Mara didn't blink. She didn't flinch, didn't fumble, didn't even lower her eyes. Instead, she took one quiet breath, placed the notepad flat on the table beside his plate, and straightened her posture. Her expression didn't change, but her silence did. It was no longer the silence of obedience. It was the silence before a storm. And then she spoke. Her voice was soft, but steady. Calm, fluent, perfect. Sehr wohl, Herr Reinhardt. Machten Sie auch ein bisschen damit mit Ihrem Steak. Her German wasn't just accurate. It was elegant, precise. The kind of tone you only hear in universities and parliaments, not restaurants. Every word landed like a quiet slap in the face. And when she finished, you could feel the air leave the room. The laughter stopped. The clinking of glasses stopped. Even the background music seemed to fade into nothing. It was as if the world itself held its breath, watching one man realize he'd just mocked someone far greater than he understood. Lucas stared at her. For the first time all night, the control he lived by was gone. His smile faltered. His fingers tightened slightly on his wine glass. He looked for something to say, a joke, a recovery, an apology. But his mouth betrayed him. Nothing came out. Mara didn't wait. She didn't need to. She simply nodded, collected the notepad, and said, in quiet English this time, "Your meal will be right out." Then she walked away. Every step she took felt heavier to him than the sound of his own heartbeat. And as she disappeared into the kitchen doorway, Lucas caught a glimpse of something he hadn't seen in years. Dignity. Not his, hers. The kind of dignity that can't be bought, can't be bargained, and doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. The table remained quiet. No one dared to laugh again. They avoided his eyes, suddenly aware of the space between laughter and cruelty, and how thin that line really was. Lucas tried to resume the evening. He tried to lift his glass, to continue the performance, but the glass trembled slightly in his hand, and in that trembling he felt something break inside him. Not anger, not humiliation, something deeper, something older, a memory. For a moment, He was no longer the billionaire in the tailored suit. He was a boy again, standing in his father's study in Munich, being told that respect isn't something you earn through money, but through how you treat those who can't give you anything in return. He remembered laughing at that lesson then, just like his friends laughed tonight. And now, decades later, he finally understood what his father had meant. He looked toward the kitchen one last time, but she was gone. All that remained was the echo of her words, still hanging in the air like truth does when it's spoken at the right time, in the right place, to the right person, and somewhere deep down, beneath the arrogance, beneath the fear of dying, beneath the empire built on control, Lucas Reinhardt felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Shame. That night, the restaurant went back to normal. The laughter returned. The lights dimmed. The conversations picked up again. But something inside Lucas didn't. Because humiliation, when deserved, doesn't leave bruises. It leaves mirrors. And before that night was over, he would find himself staring straight into one. The night followed him home like a shadow he couldn't shake. Even as the restaurant lights faded into the Manhattan skyline, her voice, calm, fluent, and impossibly dignified, lingered in his mind like a haunting echo. He told himself it was nothing, a moment of pride gone wrong. He tried to laugh it off in the car, tried to drown the thought with a sip of whiskey and the noise of the city. But when he reached his penthouse, the laughter from the restaurant, the applause from his colleagues, all of it fell away. What remained was silence. The penthouse was beautiful, the kind of beauty that costs too much. Minimalist furniture, glass walls overlooking the city, everything in its place, everything expensive, and yet it all felt lifeless, cold, curated, not lived in. The lights from the skyline painted the room in pale reflections, silver, blue, fading white. Each window was a mirror, and in each one, Lucas saw the same thing staring back. A man who had built everything except peace. He loosened his tie and sank into the couch. The exhaustion is finally showing. He wasn't tired from the day. He was tired from pretending, from performing, from the constant need to be the man the world expected him to be. He poured himself a drink. It didn't burn the way it used to. Even whiskey loses its fire when you've lost your soul. He picked up his phone and opened a news app. His name is in headlines again. Reinhardt's AI dominates the market. LinguaCore valued at $4.2 billion. The articles praised him like a prophet. But the words didn't land the same way anymore. Because tonight, someone had reminded him what he really was. Not a genius, not a visionary. Just another man mistaking arrogance for intelligence. He thought of her again. The waitress with the quiet eyes and perfect German. Mara, he repeated under his breath, as if saying her name might make the guilt feel smaller. It didn't. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped tightly together. He hadn't prayed in years, not since his father died. But in that moment, the silence felt like a kind of prayer. He didn't know what he wanted forgiveness for more. The way he treated her, or the way he'd treated himself all these years. Because somewhere along the line, he had become the very man his father warned him not to become. He remembered being 16, standing in his father's old workshop in Munich. The smell of oil and wood polish, the faint ticking of a clock. His father, a teacher by trade, had once told him, "Lucas, the measure of a man is not how much he earns, but how he treats the ones who serve him." Back then, Lucas laughed. He thought humility was just a word for the poor. Now, in a Manhattan penthouse worth $40 million, that old memory came back like a ghost. A lesson he ignored. A debt he never paid. He stood up, restless, pacing by the window. The rain traced slow lines down the glass, each drop catching the reflection of the city lights, splitting it, distorting it. The way guilt distorts the truth. He walked to his desk, the surface covered in documents, contracts, reports, patent renewals. He reached for his laptop, opened it, and typed her name into the employee database. Mara Vogel. The name came up instantly. Current employment: Lumiere Manhattan, restaurant staff. No prior connections. No visible past. After the acquisition collapsed her research team, she left academia altogether. The lawsuit had drained her savings and her reputation. Years later, New York offered anonymity she could afford. That alone made him curious. He leaned closer, opened another tab, and ran a search through the company's archive data systems. A habit from years of obsession with detail. At first, nothing. Then, a flicker. A familiar line of text in an old acquisition report from 2013. He'd skimmed these reports years ago, letting lawyers and analysts handle the details. Delegation had been his shield. He never looked closely at the people whose work built his empire. Project LinguaNet, core translation model, developed by Dr. M. Vogel, University of Berlin. His breath caught. His fingers froze above the keyboard. He clicked deeper, scanning legal agreements, signatures, and research notes. And there it was, her signature, her handwriting, the foundation of the translation algorithm, the one that made his company billions, had originated from her. Her idea, her research, her name, all of it had been buried beneath the phrase he'd grown to love. Property of Reinhardt Industries. He scrolled further and attached memo. Acquisition rights absorbed. Developer to be reassigned pending funding closure. Reassigned. That was the word they used when they erased someone. He pushed his chair back and just sat there, staring at the monitor, watching the ghost of her name flicker on the screen. The humiliation from earlier returned, but this time it wasn't from her. It was from himself. He realized for the first time how much of his life was built on other people's silence. People like her, people too honest, too small, or too tired to fight back. And it hit him. This was his legacy. Not the billion-dollar company, not the innovation, but the theft, the arrogance, the erasure. He leaned back, eyes closed, and felt the first true pain that had nothing to do with his cancer. It was the pain of recognition, of finally seeing himself clearly. For years, he had thought his illness was his punishment. But maybe maybe the real disease wasn't the one inside his body. It was the one inside his character. He stood, walked to the window again, and pressed his palm against the cold glass. Below, Manhattan glittered like a kingdom. 1,000,000 tiny lights, each one representing a person chasing something they thought would save them. He used to be one of them. And now, standing there in the dark, he realized that in chasing power, he had run past the one thing that made him human, empathy. He whispered her name again, quietly, this time like an apology. Mara. The sound of it almost broke him. He thought of her face when she spoke. The calmness, the composure. That wasn't defiance. That was a strength. Strength that doesn't need to shout. The kind of strength that comes from surviving injustice and choosing grace instead of vengeance. He envied her for that. He admired her. And somewhere deep down, beneath all the guilt and pride, a decision began to take shape. Small, quiet, but real. He was going to make it right. He didn't know how yet. But he knew this. He couldn't die, leaving things the way they were. He looked around the penthouse one last time. Every object in that room, the awards, the paintings, the skyline, suddenly felt meaningless. He opened a drawer, took out an old photo of his father, one he hadn't looked at in years. The man stared back at him, calm and patient, as if waiting for Lucas to finally understand. And for the first time in decades, Lucas Reinhardt whispered something he hadn't said since he was a boy. I remember, Fata. I remember now. He sat back down at his desk, closed all the open files except one. Her old research paper. Line by line, he read through it. The passion, the precision, the brilliance in every word. By the time he reached the end, the tears had already fallen. They weren't loud. They weren't dramatic. They were quiet. The kind of tears that come when a man realizes the only person he ever needed to impress was the one he betrayed. And as dawn began to touch the edge of the skyline, Lucas Reinhardt made a promise to himself that before he left this world, he would give her back everything he took. Not just her credit, not just her recognition, but her dignity. The morning came slowly, the kind of morning that doesn't rush you. It just watches you. And for Lucas Reinhardt, that felt fair. He'd spent decades running from time, from the truth, from mortality, from himself. But now time had caught up and all it wanted was silence and honesty. He woke up before the city did. The sun hadn't fully risen. It was a gray-blue hour, quiet enough for regret to breathe. His hands trembled as he buttoned his shirt, not from weakness this time, but from the strange, heavy calm of knowing what he was about to do. He looked at his reflection in the mirror. The same man the world still saw as powerful, brilliant, untouchable. But this morning, the illusion was gone. The skin under his eyes had gone pale, thin. The veins beneath it were visible. His body was failing, but for the first time in years, his conscience wasn't. He poured a cup of coffee, took one sip, and smiled bitterly. He couldn't taste it. Cancer dulls everything eventually: food, drink, ambition, pride. But truth? Truth still burns on the way out. He sat by the window overlooking the Hudson River. The city stretched before him, indifferent, endless, alive. He had built something that stretched across the world. And yet, none of it felt like his anymore. Because somewhere years ago, in an office full of signatures and lies, he had taken something that wasn't his. And that woman's calm voice, the one that had silenced a room full of billionaires, still echoed in his head like a prayer he didn't deserve to say. He reached for his phone, found his assistant's number, the one person who still understood the weight of his silences, and dialed. The phone rang once, twice, and then a voice answered. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Sometimes silence says everything. He closed his eyes, nodded once, and whispered just two words. It's time. The next few hours were a blur of small motions that carried the weight of a lifetime. A car arrived. His assistant helped him down the steps. No press, no crowd, no entourage. He didn't want an audience. He wanted peace. The car ride was quiet. Rain fell in soft streaks across the glass. And in that sound, that slow, rhythmic tapping, he found something he hadn't felt in years. Acceptance. When they arrived, the building wasn't what most people expected from a billionaire's empire. No marble floors or gold accents. Just steel, glass, and history. The headquarters of Lingua Core Technologies. The company that had made him rich. And her forgotten. He stepped into the elevator. The mirrored walls reflected his image at him. But it wasn't the reflection of power anymore. It was the reflection of consequence. By the time the doors opened on the top floor, his body was already tired. He coughed softly into his hand, a small, dry sound that reminded him how little time was left. He made his way to the conference room, the one where he had once closed billion-dollar deals with the confidence of a man who thought himself immortal. Now, he walked in like a man entering a confessional. The lights were dimmed. Only a few key board members were there. And at the far end of the room, her, Mara Vogel. She hadn't changed much since that night. Except now, the quiet in her eyes felt heavier. The kind that comes from a lifetime of being unseen. She didn't speak. Neither did he. The silence between them was its own language. He sat down slowly, folded his hands, and began speaking not to her, but to the air, to the truth that had waited too long. He told them everything. How her algorithm became his empire. How her name was erased from patents and contracts. How he'd built an entire legacy on her silence. And how the very thing that made his company powerful, the code that understood every human language, was born from the one human act he'd forgotten: respect. He didn't defend himself. He didn't beg. He just told it. Plain, simple, honest. Each word felt like a stone lifted from his chest. Each confession, a piece of armor falling away. And when he was done, the room didn't applaud. It didn't speak. It just listened. Then he looked at her, and for the first time, his eyes didn't carry power. They carried an apology. He said softly, "I stole your voice, Mara. But you gave me mine back." Lawyers would finish the filings later, but the signatures began what mattered most: the return of truth. He signed the papers in front of her, transferring the patents, the ownership, the credit, everything that should have been hers all along. And as he signed, his hand trembled, not from weakness, but from the weight of something heavier than regret. The weight of finally doing the right thing. When he was finished, he closed the folder and leaned back in his chair. The faint light from the window caught the edge of his face, half in shadow, half in sun. He smiled faintly, not the smile of arrogance or charm, but the tired, peaceful smile of a man who had nothing left to prove. She didn't thank him, and he didn't expect her to, because true justice doesn't need applause. It just needs to be done. He stood slowly, his body swaying slightly with the effort, and whispered, almost to himself, "It's strange how peace always arrives after pride is gone." And then he walked out of the room. He didn't know where he was going. He just knew he had to move, to walk through the building one last time, to see the faces that had built his dream for him. Every step felt lighter now. Every breath is a little easier. For years, he had been carrying a secret heavier than his own illness. Now it was gone. When he stepped outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds had parted just enough for sunlight to spill across the street, turning the wet pavement into glass. He stood there for a while, watching people move past him, busy, alive, unaware. And he thought about something his father once said, that a man doesn't die when his heart stops beating. He dies the day he stops being honest. Today, for the first time in decades, Lucas Reinhardt was alive again. He didn't know how many days he had left, however many there were. They finally belonged to him. He looked up at the morning sky and whispered under his breath, not to anyone, just to the wind, to the memory of a lesson he finally understood. It was never about the empire. It was always about the people I forgot to respect. And that silence, for the first time, felt like forgiveness. The hospice smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh linen, of coffee and the faint perfume of lilies. Small things, ordinary things that tried to make endings feel tidy. It didn't work that way, of course. Endings are rarely tidy. They are messy, memory-strewn, small and large all at once. But the room was quiet, and quiet is a kind of mercy. Lucas lay propped against pillows, forehead pale and a little translucent. The machines nearby ticked and breathed their measured mechanical compassion. He had fewer words now, but when he spoke, each one carried the weight of a life unspooling and finally making sense. She arrived in the soft hours of the afternoon, when the sunlight angled through the blinds and painted the walls in a forgiving gold. She had spent months deciding whether to come. Forgiveness hadn't arrived easily. It had been built piece by piece, out of time and truth. Mara opened the door without announcing herself, because she knew, and because he had always preferred it that way. She moved slowly, carrying a small paper cup of tea and a folded scarf, the same quiet gesture she had used for so many people in so many rooms. When she reached his bedside, she paused only long enough to fold the scarf with deliberate care, then looked at him as if reading a page she'd studied for years. Not eager, not resentful, simply present. He smiled, the kind of fragile smile that leaks truth. It did not try to convince anyone of anything. It merely existed as a small, honest thing. He lifted his hand, stiff, lined with veins that looked like maps of storms. Mara took it without hesitation, like someone taking the last thing offered on a long journey. His fingers closed around hers with the clumsy confidence of a man grateful to be held by human warmth. She did not begin with apologies. There was no rehearsed litany, no triumphant pronouncement. Instead, there was a quiet catalog of small things. The day he forgot to call his mother, the time he missed a child's recital because he was closing a deal, the curt email that once pushed someone off a project. It was not an inventory of crimes so much as an acknowledgement of the ordinary harm that accumulates into consequence. He listened like a man finally willing to learn the language of his own life, a language his father might have spoken to him in a worn study in Munich, plain, exact, and unembellished. At one point, his voice grew clearer, and he said, very plainly, "If I could do it again, if I had another life, I would have learned to be kinder sooner." She squeezed his hand. No words, just the squeeze, which is sometimes more language than anything else. He asked for one small thing. Not money, not a title, not a legacy rearranged in the world's eyes. He asked softly for forgiveness, not because he expected it, but because asking was the only honest act he had left. "Forgive me," he said, and the syllables trembled like a reed. Mara's face folded with something like compassion and fatigue. She had never wanted revenge. She had wanted the truth. She wanted the world to remember what it had taken from her. He had given her that. She looked down for a long moment, as if touching the old wound to see if it had closed. When she finally spoke, it was not the harshness of a judge, nor the brittle politeness of someone who had been wronged. It was the steady tone of a person who had survived and therefore understood what survival costs. "You already did what mattered," she said. "You told the truth. You gave it back." He sighed, the sound a small surrender. The machines whirred on, steady and indifferent. Outside, the city moved through its late afternoon rhythm. Taxis, a dog walker, a couple arguing softly about the color of paint for their kitchen. The world, loudly alive, continued to get on with itself. He took a breath that shuddered halfway and then steadied. Words came slowly. He said, "I always thought if I took enough things, I could stitch together an unbreakable life. I thought," and he coughed, a dry sound that left the sentence incomplete. "I thought I could buy safety. I was wrong." She touched his wrist. "You remembered," she said. "You remembered the people you used to be. That's not nothing." He smiled, a little wry, a little rueful. "It's funny," he whispered, voice thin as paper but steady, like someone choosing a final phrase with care. "I spent my life chasing the future, and now the thing I want most is the yesterdays." That line, honest, aching, hung between them. There was no flourish, only the simple truth of a man asking the world to let him go, having done one right thing. "You remember what I said in Munich?" he asked, voice a thread. "My father said something simple, that the measure of a life was not the things you had, but the small ways you honored other people." He closed his eyes and breathed a slow, measured breath. Mara replied with the kind of tenderness that doesn't demand anything in return. Nostalgia has a way of reminding us what really mattered. He smiled at that. There was gratitude and surprise there, as if he had received a gift he didn't deserve. "Then I am grateful," he said. And he meant it. In the hours that followed, they spoke of other things, not big, elaborate confessions, but small human pieces. The music he loved as a boy, the taste of his mother's plum jam, the smell of snow in Munich when he was 12. These fragments felt important now, because life reduces itself to fragments when it nears its end. They laughed, the sound small and incredulous, but honest. Laughter here was not escape, but medicine. It patched edges. At one point, Mara reached into her bag and pulled out a small notebook. Inside were a few notes she'd made over the months since the press conference, names of young linguists who needed scholarships, a list of universities she thought the world should fund, a plan for the scholarship program she intended to start. She turned the notebook toward him, like offering a map. "This is the thing I want to build," she said. "If you're willing, the foundation could bear your name too, in whichever way you want it to." He studied the handwriting, the lists, evidence of a life that kept going between shifts, the quiet perseverance of someone who had shouldered an entire absence of recognition and yet cultivated purpose anyway. The gratitude in his eyes was clean, not performative. "I would like that," he breathed. Time trickled. The monitors kept their metronome. The light slid across the floor in a slow, patient arc outside. A plane passed overhead, a small glint against a late sky. The world was larger than their room, and yet for those hours, the room contained more universe than any horizon ever could. When the breath grew thinner and his eyelids fluttered as if in a soft wind, Mara held his hand tighter. "You did something hard," she said simply. "You chose truth when most people choose comfort. That's rare." He tried to laugh, but could only make a small sound that gathered into a cough. When it subsided, he closed his eyes and drew in a long, slow breath. For a moment, he seemed to travel. A picture flitted across his face, perhaps of a memory, perhaps a forgiveness he had been given. His brow softened. He whispered, perhaps more to himself than to anyone in the room, "Tell them I remembered." The voice slipped into the small, private place between two people who had been through too much to waste words on pretense. Mara answered, voice soft and certain, "I will." She bent down and kissed his forehead, a small domestic gesture that held more absolution than any ritual could. She did not say the words you expect from a movie, "I forgive you," because forgiveness in this story is not a coin to be spent. It is a quiet act lived through truth, action, and the repairing of something broken. When his breathing changed, slow, shallow, each inhale a small labor, Mara leaned closer and read to him from the notebook. Not speeches, not manifestos, but names, institutions, the first 2 scholars to be funded, the small steps that would make a lifetime of theft into a future of giving. Each name she read became a seed being sown. He listened. His lips moved. Sometimes he mouthed words she could not make out. But his attention was there, and that was the thing that mattered most. Presence, not proclamation. As the light softened toward evening, his fingers slackened in hers. He opened his eyes, looked at her with a clarity that made the room seem larger than it had been in years. For an instant, there was no CEO, no empire, no headlines, only a man and the person who had, without malice, forced him to become smaller and then, finally, human. He breathed in. He breathed out. The machines puttered dutifully. Outside, the city hummed. Mara held his hand, as if holding the last page of a long book. He smiled a small, satisfied smile. "Thank you," he said, the words barely audible. "For staying." She smiled back, eyes wet but steady. "You remembered," she replied, the weight behind the words anchoring everything between them. And then, with a final breath that was both release and hello, his chest silenced. The machines hummed once, and then eased into an unhurried quiet. The moment felt larger than the room, not because of any grand gesture, but because of what had been done in quiet, small, human ways. truth spoken, credit returned, a promise to build something new. Mara pressed her forehead to his and stayed there for a long time, listening to the echo of his breathing until the sound faded. Outside, the sky was a smear of late afternoon gold and gray folded together. She sat back slowly, wiped her eyes with the heel of her hand, and let out a breath that tasted like both grief and relief. There were no triumphal banners, no crowds, no sound bites, only a notebook full of names, a pair of hands now empty but warm, and a promise that the past would be made part of the future. Mara gathered the small things she had brought, the scarf, the notebook, and stood. She placed a light kiss on his forehead again, a benediction that belonged to neither the powerful nor the powerless, but to the human in both. She walked out of the hospice into a world that did not change because one life ended. The traffic still flowed. People still argued about small things, but something quietly had shifted. A wrong had been named. A right had been set into motion. The past that had been stolen would seed futures for others. She stepped into the light and paused, looking up at the city that had seemed so indifferent. There was no glory, no songs, only work to be done. Letters to write, meetings to organize, a foundation to build, and names to remember. And she did not walk away with bitterness. She walked away with a quiet dignity that belonged to a person who had refused to make their suffering into a spectacle. In the end, people will remember many things about a life. They will remember innovations, lawsuits, boardroom battles, all the things that make good headlines. But some memories are quieter. They are the ones that come from the small acts no camera ever sees. The choice to tell the truth, the courage to hand something back, the decision to use wealth to lift others rather than prop up yourself. And he, who once thought power meant never bending, learned, finally, how to bow. Because he learned, at the end, that the future is made by those who never forget the past. And in remembering, he gave her and the world a way forward.